A war isn't just won with grand strategy and overwhelming firepower. History remembers the generals, the big turning point battles, and the machines of conquest. But underneath that official story lies a deeper, more fundamental truth. A war is made of mud. It's made of hunger, fear, and waiting. And more than anything, it's made of problems. A bootlace breaks. A can of food won't open. A 30-ton tank is stopped dead by a wall of dirt and roots. So, what happens when the standard issue gear fails? When the rulebook is useless? Human ingenuity happens. The Second World War, more than any conflict before it, became a global laboratory for improvisation. It was a 6-year contest of desperation and cleverness, fought not just by engineers in distant factories, but by muddy, exhausted soldiers, sailors, and airmen who had to invent their way out of a crisis or die. They used scrap metal, salvaged wire, empty shell casings, anything they could get their hands on to create solutions. These weren't polished, patented products. They were rough, ugly, and absolutely brilliant. They were born from necessity, and they reveal a forgotten side of the war. The story of the unseen threads, the tiny, ingenious repairs that held the whole war machine together when it should have fallen apart. On the frozen battlefields of the Ardennes, a 30-ton Sherman tank, a masterpiece of American engineering, was useless. Not because of an enemy shell, but because of a single frozen fuel line. With a German patrol just miles away, the crew had no spare parts, no mechanics, and no hope. This beast of industrial might was defeated by a few degrees of temperature. But they had one thing, an almost comical collection of random junk scavenged over weeks of fighting. This is the story of that unseen ingenuity of World War II, of how soldiers armed with little more than trash turned everyday objects into the tools that helped win the war. Number 1, the soldier's sewing kit, the Hussif. Among the standard issue items given to every Allied soldier was a small, unassuming sewing kit, affectionately nicknamed the Housewife, or Hussif. These kits, often assembled by volunteer groups like the Red Cross, were simple fabric rolls containing needles, thread, buttons, darning wool, and perhaps a thimble and small scissors. Officially, their purpose was mundane: reattaching a button, patching a torn uniform, or sewing on rank insignia. But on the battlefield, the Hussif transformed into a multi-purpose tool of survival, its utility far exceeding its intended domestic function. In the brutal cold of a European winter, a rip in a greatcoat was not a matter of presentation. It was a potentially fatal breach in a soldier's defense against frostbite. A simple needle and the tough linen thread, sometimes waterproofed with wax, could seal that gap, preserving precious body heat. The skills to use these items were vital. Beyond clothing, the same thread was used to stitch up torn canvas packs, repair the webbing of load-bearing equipment, and keep a soldier's gear from falling apart on a long march. The humble safety pin, a common component, became a tool of endless possibility, capable of securing a field dressing, replacing a broken clasp on a rucksack, or even being bent into a makeshift fishing hook to supplement meager rations. Even the needles themselves found uses beyond fabric. Employed to remove splinters or, in dire medical emergencies, sterilized in a flame to help close a wound. This small roll of fabric and its simple contents became a lifeline, a symbol of the soldier's resourcefulness. It represented the ability to mend, to hold things together, and to weave the very fabric of survival, one stitch at a time, when everything else was coming undone. Number 2, tin can and helmet. In a world defined by scarcity, nothing was ever truly garbage. Every discarded object was assessed for its future potential, and no item had a more varied and inventive second life than the simple tin can. Rations, condensed milk, cooking oil, and fuel all arrived in metal containers that, once empty, were not trash, but treasure. Their most common and celebrated transformation was into a personal stove, often called a trench stove or Tommy cooker, by punching ventilation holes into the sides of a can and filling it with a fuel source, be it solid fuel tablets, wood scraps, or even sand soaked in gasoline or diesel. A soldier could create a small, efficient heat source. This simple device provided the profound comfort of a hot cup of coffee, a warm meal, or, most critically, the ability to boil water and make it safe to drink. The same can, when filled with grease and a cloth wick, became an emergency lantern, casting a flickering, morale-boosting light in a dark dugout. The principle of repurposing extended to other gear as well. A steel helmet, dented or pierced, and no longer safe for protecting a soldier's head, found new life as a surprisingly effective tool. It became a perfect vessel for boiling water, for sterilization or cooking, a wash basin for a rare moment of hygiene, or even a shovel for hastily digging a foxhole in hard ground. Soldiers used them to bail water from flooded trenches, or carry hot embers from a fire to a new position, preserving a precious flame. Empty ammunition boxes, being sturdy and waterproof, were prized as storage containers for personal items or as makeshift seats. This mindset was a fundamental survival skill, the ability to look at a landscape of debris and see a hardware store. Every piece of shrapnel was a potential cutting tool, every wrecked vehicle a source of sheet metal and wire. Number 3, soap and chewing gum. Some of the most brilliant battlefield improvisations were also the most subtle, using common comfort items for tasks their manufacturers never imagined. Take, for example, a simple bar of soap. Its primary purpose was hygiene, a small but significant comfort that helped stave off disease and maintain a sliver of normalcy. However, soldiers quickly discovered its utility as a tool for stealth and repair. A squeaky leather rifle sling or a creaking pack strap could betray a soldier's position during a silent night patrol. Rubbing a dry bar of soap on the offending leather or webbing would silence it instantly. Zippers on jackets and gear, frequently clogged with mud and rust, could be coaxed back to life with a bit of soap applied to the teeth. In more desperate moments, there are anecdotal accounts of soldiers using softened soap to create a temporary seal on a small crack in a water canteen or even a leaking fuel container, a pliable plug that could hold for hours and prevent the loss of a critical resource. Similarly, chewing gum, a ubiquitous item in American K-rations, became a primitive but effective adhesive and sealant. Once chewed, its sticky, pliable nature made it the original duct tape. Pilots reported using it to patch small bullet holes in low-pressure fuel lines or hydraulic systems, a desperate fix that sometimes held long enough to get a damaged plane home. It could be used to temporarily stick a map to a surface in windy conditions, plug a tiny hole in a rubber hose, or even waterproof the electrical connections on a field radio. These weren't dramatic, explosive solutions. They were the quiet, clever fixes that smoothed the rough edges of life and death at the front, proving that sometimes the smallest acts of ingenuity were what kept a soldier and his equipment functioning for one more day. Number 4, improvised sterilization and wound care. Nowhere was ingenuity more critical than in battlefield medicine, where the greatest enemy after a wound was often infection. In the mud and filth of the front lines, any break in the skin was an open invitation to life-threatening bacteria. Official medical supplies, like sterile bandages, were precious and quickly exhausted during heavy fighting, forcing medics and soldiers to invent their own methods of sterilization out of sheer necessity. The most fundamental technique was the use of boiling water. Strips of cloth, ideally torn from the cleaner, inner layers of a uniform shirt, would be submerged in water heated over a trench stove. A soldier's own steel helmet or metal canteen cup, held over a small flame, became a field sterilizer, capable of killing most dangerous bacteria. It was a crude but effective process that saved countless lives. In sunnier theaters like Italy, some may have also relied on the age-old knowledge that laying laundered cloth out under direct, intense sunlight could act as a natural disinfectant, with the UV rays providing a secondary layer of protection. Other materials were also pressed into service. Thin, absorbent pages from ration books, cigarette papers, or even parachute silk could be layered to create a pad that drew fluid and contaminants away from a wound, helping to keep the area clean until it could be properly dressed. Chemical sterilization was also improvised when possible. Alcohol from a soldier's flask, high-proof spirits, or even gasoline were sometimes used to disinfect cloth or rudimentary tools when boiling wasn't an option. These methods weren't found in any official medical manual. They were born from a desperate, practical understanding of the core problem. The goal was simple: create a barrier, however crude, between a soldier's broken body and the dirt of the battlefield. Number 5, battlefield tourniquets and wound closure. When a soldier was hit, the clock started ticking, and the most immediate task was to stop the bleeding. In the chaotic moments after an injury, medics and fellow soldiers became masters of improvisation, using whatever materials were at hand to control hemorrhage. Official tourniquets were not always available, so men learned to create them from their own gear. A rifle sling, a leather belt, or torn strips of a blanket could be tied around a wounded limb and tightened to cut off blood flow. They quickly mastered the use of a windlass, a stick, bayonet, or any rigid object to twist the band, applying just enough pressure to stop arterial bleeding without causing unnecessary tissue damage. For deep wounds, especially in the torso, they relied on the brutal but effective technique of wound packing. This involved manually stuffing cloth directly into the wound cavity to create internal pressure on the damaged vessels. The soldier's ubiquitous sewing kit, the Husuf, saw its most gruesome but vital use in wound closure. A standard sewing needle, sterilized as best as possible in a flame from a lighter or with a splash of high-proof alcohol, could be used with linen thread to crudely stitch a gaping wound shut. Medics, and sometimes even the soldiers themselves, became impromptu surgeons, holding flesh and blood together just as they would fabric, creating a rough closure designed to hold just long enough to get the wounded man to an aid station. There also exists a persistent, though fiercely debated, piece of battlefield folklore about medics using tampons to plug puncture wounds from bullets or shrapnel. While official documentation is scarce, the logic behind the legend is sound. Tampons were sterile, highly absorbent, and perfectly shaped for the job. In a situation where a man was bleeding out, and the only available tool was an unconventional one, the decision was simple. Survival trumped protocol every time. Number 6, pain management beyond morphine. Pain was a constant and formidable enemy on the battlefield. Morphine syrettes were a miracle of modern medicine, but they were a finite and precious resource. When the supply ran out, medics faced the agonizing task of treating horrific injuries on fully conscious men. It was in this crucible of suffering that one of the most profound psychological discoveries of the war was made. While serving as an anesthesiologist with the U.S. Army in Italy, Dr. Henry K. Beecher made a remarkable observation. Having exhausted his supply of morphine during a major battle, he began injecting wounded soldiers with a simple saline solution, while telling them it was a powerful painkiller. To his astonishment, he found that nearly 40% of the soldiers reported a significant reduction in their pain. They believed they were receiving relief, and that belief alone produced a tangible physiological effect. Beecher's groundbreaking work after the war would formally identify and study this phenomenon, now famously known as the placebo effect, proving that the mind's expectation could be a powerful medicine in its own right. In other desperate situations, particularly in the dense jungles of the Pacific Theater, there are anecdotal stories of medics and soldiers turning to the landscape itself for relief. They reportedly learned from local populations or rediscovered ancient remedies, such as the knowledge that the bark of certain willow trees contained salicin, the natural chemical compound from which aspirin is derived. By brewing this bark into a bitter tea, they could create a natural pain reliever and anti-inflammatory. And these were not miracle cures. They were desperate measures born of a time and place where the marvels of modern medicine were a distant luxury. They demonstrate a profound truth of survival. When conventional tools fail, the most powerful resources left are the human mind and the earth itself. Number 7, the Cullen hedgerow cutter. In the summer of 1944, as Allied forces pushed inland from the D-Day beaches, their advance ground to a bloody halt in the Normandy countryside. The culprit was the bocage, a landscape of small fields separated by dense ancient hedgerows. Thick walls of earth, stone, and tangled vegetation that proved to be a near impenetrable defensive barrier. American Sherman tanks that tried to drive over these embankments would rear up, exposing their thin belly armor to concealed German anti-tank guns, with catastrophic results. The advance slowed to a deadly crawl, and top Allied commanders were stumped. The solution came not from an engineering lab, but from the muddy, desperate front lines. While several soldiers were likely experimenting with solutions, a 29-year-old tank sergeant from New Jersey named Curtis G. Cullen is widely credited with the decisive breakthrough. Cullen and his comrades got their idea from the massive, tusk-like steel obstacles the Germans themselves had placed on the invasion beaches to stop landing craft. Using scrap steel salvaged from these Rommel's asparagus roadblocks, they welded a set of sharp, powerful prongs to the front of a Sherman tank. The concept was brutally simple. Instead of trying to climb over the hedgerow, the tank would use its own 30 tons of mass and engine power to rip straight through its base. The invention, quickly nicknamed the Cullen hedgerow cutter, or rhino, for its tusk-like appearance, was an astonishing success. General Omar Bradley witnessed a demonstration and, immediately grasping its strategic importance, ordered ordnance depots to begin manufacturing them on an emergency basis. Within weeks, welders were working around the clock. And by the launch of Operation Cobra, it's estimated that 3 out of every 5 American tanks had been fitted with these makeshift teeth. The Rhino tanks allowed the armored divisions to finally break through the bocage, restoring momentum to the Allied advance and saving countless lives. Number 8, cannibalized aircraft of the Desert Air Force. In the desolate, windswept landscapes of the North African desert, the British Desert Air Force and their Commonwealth allies faced a logistical nightmare. They operated at the far end of a perilously long supply line, where spare parts for their Hurricane and Spitfire fighters were often more valuable than gold. A damaged aircraft could be grounded for weeks, waiting for a single component to arrive from Britain. Out of this grinding scarcity, the legendary repair and salvage units were born. These were not ordinary mechanics. They were masters of resurrection, and their unofficial motto could have been, "No aircraft is ever truly dead." Their primary technique was cannibalization, a grim but essential practice of stripping wrecked aircraft, both Allied and Axis, of every single usable part. A Hurricane that had crash-landed might yield a perfectly good engine, which could be transplanted into another airframe whose own engine had failed. The landing gear from a battle-damaged Spitfire could be used to get a different plane flying again. This culture of make do and mend was not just encouraged. It was essential for maintaining air superiority. The salvage yards became a bizarre mosaic of machinery from warring nations. It was not uncommon for a British Hurricane to fly with a magneto scavenged from a crashed German Messerschmitt Bf-109, or for the hydraulic lines from a wrecked Italian fighter to find a new home in a P-40 Warhawk. Mechanics became masters of adaptation, fashioning tire patches from salvaged rubber and canvas soaked in tar. They stripped copper wiring from destroyed trucks to repair radios and instruments. They pieced together Frankenplanes from the remains of half a dozen different wrecks, machines that were ugly and non-standard, but that flew and fought. In a war of attrition, victory often goes to the side that can most cleverly recycle its own destruction. The work of the repair and salvage units was a testament to that fact. A gritty, ingenious effort that kept the Air Force flying when, by all reasonable measures, it should have been grounded. Number 9, the farm boy fix. Beyond the documented inventions, the war was filled with legendary, and often anonymous, tales of the farm boy fix. These were stories of soldiers whose civilian skills, honed in fields and workshops far from any battlefield, suddenly became invaluable assets. Imagine a young private from America's heartland, a man who grew up keeping a family farm's ancient, worn-out tractor running with nothing more than baling wire and sheer determination. He gets assigned to a motor pool in the choking dust and oppressive heat of Sicily, where the iconic Willys MB Jeeps are constantly overheating and breaking down. To the mechanics who strictly follow the field manual, a failing engine is a complex problem requiring specific parts and procedures. But to the farm boy, the sputtering engine isn't a mystery. It's a familiar challenge he's seen a dozen times on a combine harvester. So, while others wait for supplies, he tinkers. Perhaps he notices that the standard oil pan is too small for the extreme operating temperatures. Drawing on his experience, he scavenges a larger oil sump from a wrecked truck, expertly welding it to the Jeep's engine block to increase the oil capacity and improve cooling. He might fabricate a new fan shroud from scrap metal to better direct airflow, using principles he'd learned from cooling grain silos. Maybe he reroutes a fuel line to prevent vapor lock, or installs a more robust filtration system he cobbled together from salvaged parts, knowing that battlefield fuel is often contaminated. Stories like this abound in the folklore of every motor pool and maintenance depot. They almost always end the same way. The non-regulation Frankenstein Jeep not only works but ends up outperforming the factory standard models on a grueling convoy, running cooler and longer than any other vehicle. It's a powerful lesson that repeated itself across the war. The pristine specifications of a peacetime engineer were often no match for the dirty, practical genius of a soldier who simply needed to make something work right now. The stories of the hedgerow cutter, the cannibalized airplanes, and the farm boy's Jeep are not isolated incidents. They are windows into the soul of the ordinary soldier in an extraordinary conflict. From the Soviet partisan stuffing a shredded tire with straw to keep a cart moving, to the Marine in the Pacific wrapping his rifle in canvas to keep the sand out, this spirit of improvisation was universal. It was a quiet, grassroots rebellion against the tyranny of circumstance. These acts of ingenuity rarely won medals or made it into the history books. They were the unseen threads that stitched the war effort together at its most vulnerable points. They were the small, anonymous victories of creativity over chaos, of resourcefulness over ruin. Yes, the war was won by mass production and strategic genius, but it was also held together by safety pins and chewing gum. It was pushed forward by engines running on borrowed parts, and it was sustained by men who refused to accept that something was broken beyond repair. History doesn't just shift because of generals or machines. It shifts through the collective will and intelligence of millions of individuals who face impossible problems and invent their way to a solution. These forgotten stories of how soldiers repaired everything with nothing are more than just clever anecdotes. They are a profound testament to the resilience of the human spirit and a reminder that in the darkest of times, our greatest weapon isn't the steel in our hands, but the ingenuity in our minds. If this story resonated with you, there are thousands more just like it waiting to be told. Please consider subscribing to our channel to support our mission to uncover the forgotten chapters of history. Watch our next video here, where we explore the Ghost Army, a top-secret unit that used inflatable tanks and sound effects to deceive the entire German army. Thank you for watching.